Hello, my dear ones. Sit down, grab a cup of tea, and listen carefully. This is not just any story. This is my story, my family's story, and the story of how greed and pride can blind even the ones you love the most. I am 82 years old now, and I have seen more heartbreaks than most people see in a lifetime. But nothing could have prepared me for what my own son would do, what he almost destroyed, and how life made sure justice had its day. Let me start from the beginning. I raised my son, Daniel, with nothing but love. His father had passed away when Daniel was just 8 years old, and from that day, I became both mother and father to him. I worked tirelessly, taking odd jobs, cleaning houses, sewing clothes for extra money. Anything to make sure Daniel had everything a child could dream of. I never let him feel the sting of poverty. He grew up bright, charming, and full of ambition. I remember watching him run around the small garden of our modest house, his laughter echoing against the walls. He promised me he'd make me proud, and I believed him. I believed in him because, well, he was my son. As years passed, he excelled in school. I made sure he had tutors, books, and encouragement. I even skipped meals so he could attend expensive classes that would push him ahead of his peers. "Granny, you're too kind," he'd say. "I'll pay you back one day." Those words, they stuck in my heart like glue. By the time Daniel turned 22, he had secured a position at a financial firm. I still remember the day he got his first paycheck. He came running to me with tears in his eyes. "Granny, I finally did it." And I hugged him so tightly, feeling a warmth that only a grandmother's heart can hold. That moment, that pride, it's hard to describe. But as Daniel climbed the ladder, his world changed. He started mingling with people I didn't know, people with expensive suits and even more expensive ambitions. He changed subtly at first, new clothes, new friends, new ideas. I reminded myself, change is normal. He's young. He deserves to grow. Then came the day he inherited his uncle's business. A fortune, millions of dollars, and with it, the arrogance that often accompanies wealth. He bought a huge apartment in the city, a car I could never dream of driving, and started surrounding himself with people who cared more about his money than him. I tried to stay close, to remind him gently of our roots. "Daniel, don't forget where you came from," I said one evening, as we sat together sipping tea. "Money is nothing if you lose the people who truly love you." He smiled, polite but distant. "Granny, don't worry about me. I know what I'm doing." I didn't realize then how hollow those words would become. Our home, my home, became quieter. He would visit less, call less, and when he did, it felt rushed, distracted. I would see the way he glanced at his phone every few seconds, as if some urgent matter in his new, shiny life demanded all his attention. But I tried to understand. I told myself, he's building his future. He's busy. And then the shift began. It started small, missed dinners, unreturned calls, excuses. "Granny, I have a meeting." "Granny, I'll come next week." Week after week, the warmth in our home dwindled. And then the day came when Daniel, my own son, moved into his city apartment permanently, leaving me in our small house alone. I told myself I was proud of him. I truly did. But the emptiness was sharp, like a cold knife in my chest. I missed his laughter, his voice, even the way he used to complain about my cooking. And that's when I realized it wasn't just distance that had grown between us. Something darker had crept in. A subtle arrogance. A disregard, a belief that the world owed him, and by extension, he owed me nothing. But I didn't know the full truth yet. Not even close. Because life has a way of showing its cards only when you least expect it. And that, my dear ones, is when the first cracks of betrayal appeared. The days passed quietly, almost too quietly. I had gotten used to the silence, to the echo of memories in the empty house. But deep down, I felt something wasn't right. My heart, it knew. One rainy afternoon, as I was dusting the old photo albums, I stumbled upon a receipt tucked between the pages of Daniel's childhood scrapbook. It was for a property in the city, something I had never heard him mention. Curious, I made a mental note but didn't think much of it. After all, Daniel had always been secretive about his investments. But then little things started piling up. I remember the day I called him, hoping to hear his voice. "Granny, I'm busy," he snapped. I paused, hurt slicing through me like glass. Busy? Busy avoiding me? A few days later, I went into his apartment, under the guise of visiting for a casual dinner. I wanted to see him, to check if he was truly okay. What I saw, I'll never forget. Daniel was not alone. A woman I didn't know was there, dressed in expensive clothes, her laugh ringing out like a bell. She was perched on his couch, sipping wine as if she owned the place. And Daniel, my son, he was laughing, leaning into her, his hand brushing hers in that way that made my stomach twist painfully. I stood frozen at the doorway, memories of my little boy clashing violently with the man I was seeing. "Daniel," I finally whispered, my voice barely audible. He turned startled. The smile froze. "Granny, what are you doing here?" I tried to keep my composure, but my hands trembled. "Daniel, who is she?" "Oh, this is just a friend," he said, too quickly, too nervously. I studied them closely. "A friend? Since when do friends touch each other like that? Since when do friends whisper and laugh like lovers?" He looked away, a shadow of guilt crossing his face. And in that moment, I realized the truth. My son, the boy I had raised, had grown into a man I barely recognized, a man who was no longer the same Daniel I loved. The betrayal cut deep, deeper than any wound I had ever felt. But it didn't stop there. Over the next few weeks, I began to notice other signs, subtle, cruel little things that made my heart ache. I overheard calls where he dismissed my concerns, watched as he spent money lavishly on this woman, while he barely sent a thought or a word toward the person who had given him everything. And then the ultimate betrayal. One evening, I received a letter, sealed and official. It was from Daniel's lawyer. My son had written me out of his will. Completely. Nothing. No acknowledgement. No thank you for the years I sacrificed, the nights I stayed awake, the tears I shed for him. Nothing. I sank into my chair, the letter trembling in my hands. My son, my beloved child, had forgotten me. He had erased me. For days, I wandered through the rooms of our home, feeling the weight of betrayal pressing down on me. How could he do this? After everything I had given him? After every sacrifice, every sleepless night, every ounce of love I poured into him? But life has a way of revealing secrets in its own time. A few days later, I discovered something even more shocking. I had gone through some old paperwork, trying to sort out my finances, when I found that Daniel had siphoned a significant portion of my savings into his accounts. My money, my life's work, had been quietly taken without my knowledge. I sat down on the floor, clutching my head, trying to breathe through the rage and sorrow that consumed me. How could my child do this? I realized then that this was more than betrayal. This was a deliberate, calculated act. Daniel had used me, the woman who raised him, as a stepping stone for his own selfish gain. He didn't just forget me, he intended to erase me entirely. I spent that night awake, staring at the ceiling, tears streaking down my face. But somewhere in the midst of the grief, a seed was planted. A seed of resolve. If Daniel thought he could betray me without consequences, he was wrong. I may be old, yes, but I am far from powerless. And so, the wheels of my revenge began to turn. Little did Daniel know, the woman who raised him, who had been dismissed and forgotten, was already planning a reckoning. One that he would never see coming. I began gathering information, carefully, silently, without a hint that Granny was watching, calculating, remembering everything. His habits, his friends, his weakness for approval and flattery, all of it became pieces of a puzzle. By the end of the week, I had discovered enough to start shaping my plan. Every lie, every betrayal, every stolen dollar. I cataloged it all. And I promised myself, Daniel would learn the true cost of forgetting the person who gave him life. This betrayal, this unthinkable treachery, would not go unanswered. The nights were the hardest. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Daniel's face laughing with her. The woman who had no idea what sacrifice really meant. Every memory of his childhood, every bedtime story, every tear I had wiped from his cheek. It all seemed like a cruel joke now. I cried, yes. I cried like I hadn't cried in decades. But the tears weren't just for sadness. They were for clarity, for understanding, for the anger that simmered beneath every tear. I began talking to myself softly in the empty rooms of my home. Daniel, you forget where you came from, who you are, and who loved you more than anything. But you will remember. You will remember. And with that, I began to plan. The first step was to gather every detail of his life, the people around him, the habits he thought no one noticed, his weaknesses, his vanity. I remembered the way he flinched when confronted, how he craved attention, how he always sought admiration even from strangers. These were the cracks in his armor, and I would exploit them. But revenge, I reminded myself, must be precise. It must sting, but it must not betray me. A granny underestimated. That would be his fatal mistake. I spent days walking the neighborhood, listening to casual conversations, asking gentle questions as if I were a concerned elder. How is Daniel doing at work? He's grown so fast, hasn't he? People shared everything, his recent business ventures, the extravagant parties, the friends who were really just vultures circling his wealth. Every little piece of information I gathered added fuel to the plan. And then the woman. His mistress, as it turned out, was more than she seemed. I observed her from afar, noting her greed, her charm, and her carelessness. I realized that if I played this right, she could become the first instrument of his undoing. But even as I plotted, my heart ached. This was my son, the boy who had once clutched my hand in the dark, scared of monsters under the bed. How could it come to this? How could love and betrayal coexist so violently? I cried again that night, not out of weakness, but to release the part of me that still loved him blindly. And then I smiled quietly, because love, even when betrayed, can be the greatest weapon in the hands of someone wise. I began writing. Notes. Observations. Small little reminders of who he had become. Each one was a thread, and soon, the web of my revenge would be complete. The first phase was simple but essential. Expose him to the truth of his own arrogance. Let him feel, even for a moment, the loneliness and emptiness he had inflicted upon me. The second phase, that would come later. The part where he would realize that every action has a consequence. Every evening, I rehearsed conversations in my head. What would I say if confronted directly? How would I manipulate the situation without him suspecting that Granny was pulling the strings all along? I even practiced my expressions in the mirror, soft, kind, loving, the perfect mask of innocence. No one suspected that behind these gentle eyes, a storm was brewing. The emotional turmoil was almost unbearable. I oscillated between tears and rage, between longing for the son I once knew and the fury for the man who had forgotten me. Yet, this turmoil became the engine of my resolve. Every night I went to bed exhausted, but also energized. I was ready. I found allies in unexpected places. The friends he trusted blindly, the people he flaunted his wealth in front of, they became pieces of the chessboard. Some unknowingly, some because I gently nudged them, and all without revealing my hand. Then came the breakthrough. A careless comment, overheard in a cafe, gave me the perfect leverage. Daniel had made a promise, one of arrogance and pride, that he could not possibly keep. It was the key to the trap I had been constructing. The irony? It was his own words that would eventually bring him to his knees. I remember sitting by the fireplace that night, a cup of tea in hand, my knitting lying forgotten on my lap, and thinking, yes, this is the moment. Granny may be old, but she remembers everything. She never forgets. And with that resolve, I set the timeline. Each step carefully planned, each move calculated. He would not see it coming, not because he was clever, but because he had grown arrogant. He had grown careless. He had grown blind to the one thing he should have never underestimated. A mother's love turned into righteous fury. I went to bed that night feeling lighter than I had in months. For the first time since discovering the betrayal, I felt not just anger, but purpose. I was no longer a victim. I was the architect of what was to come. And Daniel had no idea what awaited him. I had planned every detail carefully. Revenge, I knew, was not about blind fury. It was about precision, timing, and exploiting the very weaknesses that Daniel had so arrogantly displayed. It began subtly, almost invisibly. I started by befriending his closest circle, his friends who hung around not for him, but for his fortune. I asked innocent questions, shared gentle observations, and watched them squirm under the weight of their own greed. Soon enough, whispers reached Daniel, planted by none other than Granny herself. Daniel, one friend said nervously at a party, you might want to double-check those accounts, just a thought. Daniel brushed it off, laughing, confident as always. That confidence, that pride, it was exactly what I needed. He never suspected me. The first act of revenge was simple but stinging, financial embarrassment. I had discovered discrepancies in his accounts, minor enough to avoid legal trouble, but public enough to shake his confidence. Small withdrawals, subtle redirections, harmless on paper. But to him, they were invisible cracks forming in the foundation of his empire. Then came the second phase. I knew Daniel adored the new woman in his life. She had become his weakness, a source of pride and distraction. So I arranged for a chance encounter. A mutual acquaintance, whom I had quietly influenced, told her the truth about Daniel's past. How he had used and abandoned me, the very woman who raised him. The reaction was instantaneous. Her trust shattered. Arguments erupted. Her love, which Daniel had flaunted like a trophy, turned cold. And he had no idea how Granny had orchestrated the chain of events that left his personal life in chaos. But the real masterpiece, the piece de resistance, was yet to come. I turned my attention to the public stage. Daniel had been flaunting his wealth, hosting lavish events, showing off his success to anyone who would look. I carefully leaked small, carefully crafted rumors to journalists and social media. Nothing illegal, nothing libelous, but enough to seed doubt. Suddenly, whispers circulated. Daniel was reckless, careless, and untrustworthy. His friends began distancing themselves, sensing the shift. Daniel's confidence began to crack. He tried to laugh it off, but the cracks spread. Invitations were declined, deals were postponed, and even his employees began questioning his decisions. All of it orchestrated silently by me. Then I struck at the heart, the emotional core. One evening, I appeared at his apartment, unannounced, carrying a box. Daniel froze. "Granny, what are you doing here?" I smiled sweetly. "Daniel, I thought you might want to see something." Inside the box were letters, photographs, and mementos from his childhood. The evidence of every sacrifice I had made, every sleepless night, every penny spent on his future. I left them on his table, neatly arranged. "You may have forgotten me," I said softly, "but these will remind you of who you are, of who raised you." Daniel's face turned pale. He reached for a letter. His hands shook. "Granny, I didn't." I held up a finger. "Should just read." Hours passed, and I watched silently as he read every note, every photograph, every memory. His pride crumbled, his arrogance shattered. For the first time, he felt the weight of the betrayal he had committed. Not against me, but against himself, against his own soul. And then the final act. I had arranged for a meeting between Daniel and the very woman he had flaunted in front of me. I didn't need to say much. The letters and memories spoke for themselves. The confrontation was unavoidable. Accusations flew, emotions erupted, and in that chaos, Daniel realized how shallow his life had become. How hollow his victories were when the person who had loved him most had been cast aside. The woman left, disgusted by his behavior. His friends withdrew, realizing the man they had once envied was nothing without those who truly cared. His wealth remained, yes, but the foundation he had built, trust, loyalty, respect, crumbled beneath him. I didn't gloat. I simply watched quietly as the consequences unfolded. Revenge, I realized, is not about vengeance alone. It's about letting people feel the natural consequences of their actions. And Daniel, he felt them bone deep. Days later, Daniel came to me, humbled, ashamed, begging, not for money, not for favors, but for forgiveness. Granny, I was wrong. I forgot who I was. Please help me. I looked at him, my heart a mixture of sadness, pride, and relief. Daniel, you have much to learn. But yes, you may start by remembering what truly matters. And that, my dear ones, was the moment the scales of justice tipped, not through law, not through wealth, but through the quiet power of experience, patience, and love. It's been some time since all of that unfolded. When I look back now, I don't feel pride in having brought my son down. I feel peace, and something deeper, a sense that I finally stood for what was right, for what love means when it's been cast aside. Daniel is not the same man he was before. He's quieter. He listens more. He looks at me now, not with guilt or fear, but with something I hadn't seen in years: respect. Regret, yes, but also gratitude. It's strange how life works. The very man who once forgot me now seeks my wisdom. He still has money, though far less than before, but that's not what matters. He's rebuilding his life from the inside out. Slowly, he's learning that relationships cannot be bought, and that no amount of wealth can replace the love and care that nurtured him when he was nothing. I've forgiven him, though forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. I carry those painful memories like scars, but scars, I've learned, are reminders of strength. Without them, how would we know we survived? People ask me, Granny, why didn't you just walk away? Why not let karma handle it? I smile. Karma does its part, yes, but sometimes it needs a little guidance. Sometimes love must teach a lesson that others won't hear unless it's written in the deepest corners of their soul. Revenge? It's a dangerous path if driven by hatred. But when it's guided by love, patience, and purpose, it can help someone rediscover themselves. I never wanted to hurt Daniel for the sake of hurting him. I wanted him to face the emptiness that pride had created, to feel the weight of betrayal, so he could choose a better way. I've also learned something else. Pain connects us. The loneliness I felt, the nights of crying silently in the dark, they taught me that love is not always easy. It doesn't protect us from betrayal, but it gives us the strength to rise above it. Now, when I sit by the window in the afternoons and sip my tea, I watch the world with calm eyes. I still worry for Daniel, of course. He's learning, stumbling, and trying, but he's trying. That's what matters. So, if you're listening, if you're holding on to hurt or betrayal, know this: you are stronger than you think. You don't need to lash out blindly or let bitterness consume you. Sometimes the best revenge is the quiet strength to stand your ground, to let the truth unfold, and to remind those who've wronged you what real love means. And remember, never underestimate the power of a mother's heart. Even when bruised, even when broken, it can still teach the hardest lessons and guide the lost back to the light. That's my story. It's painful, yes, but it's also proof that love, when tempered with wisdom, can change lives, even those of people who have forgotten what love means.